if anybody here received an email inviting, if anybody's been volunteering for Barnet and received an email inviting them to a thank you evening and has not replied, please can you do so?
I have.
I know you have. And Francis, you've replied.
What was the one that you sent two from you? What was that about?
That was me replying. Because
okay, I'm gonna just stop you for a second, just because we have to start. But please do continue that conversation elsewhere. The amazing thing about Zoom is that it's a shame we're going back to shul. I can't meet my congregants. I'm just joking. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Chasing Lullabies, and welcome to a couple of new faces. So some of you may know that Chasing Lullabies got featured in the Jewish Chronicle over the weekend, and so a few people who were inspired enough to log in this evening. So welcome to you, and welcome back to everyone who is a frequent chaser of lullabies. Welcome back. We are just at the beginning of our exploration of the book of Leviticus, the book of Vayikra, and so we really are at the cusp of starting to unpack this concept called sacrifices. And the little spiel that we sometimes do at the beginning of Chasing Lullabies is, as I mentioned in the JC article, is just to notice that there are so many times that we come across texts or ideas that we stop thinking about because we're so used to them. We're so used to a certain way of processing them or thinking about them that they don't become subject to any more thinking, any more investigation. So rockabye baby on the tree top, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock, when the bell breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby. Baby and all. Why are we singing about killing children? Well, it's because we stopped thinking about the fact that those words had a rather scary, freaky meaning to them, and instead we just sing it anyway. And that's the truth with many Torah stories. And in our investigations of Genesis, which we already carried out, also in Bamidbar, in Devarim, we've done a few of these pieces. We've done a few of these pieces already, where we started to open up some of those stories that many of us grew up with, but left them at the level of a story and didn't start to ask the bigger, deeper questions about them. I think possibly an exception to that is the book of Leviticus, where rather than leaving it as something which is a story, we probably just relegate it to something which is weird, something which I cannot relate to, which I refuse to relate to. And something where we sort of grin and bear the Torah portions of Vayikra as something that is archaic and disconnected from any part of my life. And so the challenge that we faced last week was beginning to ask questions about sacrifices, beginning to ask questions about why one would take an animal, rest one's hands on its head, slaughter it, receive its blood, run the blood over to the altar of God and sprinkle it onto the altar. Why one would even think about doing such a thing? What would that be achieving? What would be the purpose? We started to try and move away from sort of discussions around animal welfare, animal cruelty, by noticing that if we were really concerned about that, we would not at all tolerate industrialized agriculture on any shape or form. That sometimes we get a bit stuck, I think, on the way that animals are killed rather than thinking about how animals lived. If you want to care about an animal, make sure it's got a good quality of life whilst it's alive. If you're comfortable eating animals, meaning in the context of taking away their life, whether taking away their life takes an extra half a minute or not, is probably less relevant compared to the vast majority of their life, which is either is it lived well, is it lived with space, with adequate and appropriate nutrition, or are they stuck in a box, unable to even bear the weight of their feet because, or bear the weight of their body because they are simply a product to be fattened until they are at the requisite size. So we tried to move away from that and move more into the symbolism and meaning of sacrifices. And it's sort of here that we are at this moment in time. And so it's here I'd like to pick up anyone wants to catch up, last time's session, it was a few weeks ago. We had Pesach and bank holiday to contend with before coming back. But what I'd like to focus on and begin with tonight is to sort of contextualize the discussion by considering the use of metaphor and symbolism within worship. Because I think it's with a sensitivity to this idea, the use of symbolism and metaphor, not just maybe within worship, but also within any relationship, that it'd be helpful to start to unpack the idea of sacrifices and to really get a sense of what's going on with this service. Let's begin by thinking about something which I remember hearing so many times, almost like it became a buzzword, but without opening up what it meant, it felt fruitless. So we often hear inspiring messages or religious leaders talking about having a relationship with God. And actually, if you start to unpick, what on earth that means, that feels like a very tricky concept. What do we have a relationship normally with? And by the way, please feel free, those of you who are new to Chasing Lullabies, this is very much a free-flowing conversation. It's not just me talking to you. It's a dialogue and a discourse. So please feel free to press the space bar to unmute yourself, or just to click unmute and chip in with questions or comments as we go. When you sort of drill down to this idea of having a relationship with God, well, you could just argue that you're talking to yourself. You know, imagine having a relationship with someone where you just talk and the other person says nothing whatsoever. If I was to start making some sort of weird and slightly stereotypical traditional joke, I'd be like, well, that's the greatest wish, that no one answers back. But really, that's not the greatest wish, that no one answers back. That's not a relationship. That's simply having an echo chamber. So how does one have a relationship with a being that is not physical, not corporeal, doesn't have a body, doesn't answer you in a direct fashion? You don't even necessarily feel the presence of this other being. So I suppose if you think about a normal relationship, we do have both concrete expression of the relationship and metaphorical expression of the relationship, or non-physical, non sort of grounded, non-concrete expressions of a relationship. So thinking about it like this, let's imagine a person loves someone else very much. Let's say there's a romantic, there's a deep, there's a loving relationship between two partners. Now, there's different ways that that relationship is expressed. There's one way which is very concrete: hand-holding, touch, kiss, gifts, conversations, play, all the different parts, right? Dates, all the different parts, eating together, doing things together, shared activities, shared interests. Those are all the ways that one has a relationship with someone else. It's with concrete expressions. And that's pretty empty when it comes to, or could be theoretically pretty empty when it comes to someone who doesn't reciprocate by, you can't hold God's hand necessarily. Last time I checked, you can't sleep with God. You can't spend an afternoon watching a play together. You can't necessarily go for a walk, admiring the scenery and tutting about how long it's taking for the country to open up following lockdown. You can't have a joke with God. You can't dance in the kitchen with God. By the way, I'm kind of caveat this at some point, which is that maybe you can do all those things, but you could argue that at first glance it doesn't seem like any of that is possible. Those are all concrete expressions of a relationship which seem to be present with a human being and seem to be absent with God. When it comes to other parts of a relationship, it might be more possible. Sometimes we exist in a world of metaphor when it comes to our partners. So, as an example, if I was to give my wife a ring, let's say I was to give her a ring, so possibly more than the actual gift itself, possibly more than what this ring is in terms of the precious metals or the stone, is what the ring represents to her. Does it represent an eternity? Does it represent devotion? Does it represent commitment? So thereby the concrete has become much more than something tangible. It's become an expression of my devotion. there are certain days that might be special in the calendar where you and your partner have recollections of anniversaries of the first time we did this. I remember that this was one time that happened, and so there are days that have personal resonance to the relationship. This is not a concrete expression of a relationship. It's more like a metaphorical expression. It's like moments in time that have particular significance. There you could argue that there's more of a and there you could argue that there's more of a natural expression to infinity, to have a relationship with infinity in the world of metaphor, in the world where it's not something which is tangible, like it's not what the ring is. It's not that, it's not the fact that Shoshana and I, for example, my wife's not interested in how much precious metal is in this band. My wife is interested in what the band communicates about our relationship. So whereas spending time together is also about spending time together, it's actually about the process of having shared time. This gift is not really about the precious metal, right? And she's not taking it to a jeweler to evaluate how much money she could sell it and pawn it on for. Oh gosh, this is like £500. He must really love me. No, it's about the fact that there was an effort. There was a communication through the item. So the concrete has become something more than the concrete. And there you could argue that there's space to have a relationship with God, whereby something which is concrete becomes a metaphor for something else. So you want to put that back and plug that back into a sacrifice, a korban. The Hebrew word for korban it comes from the word karav, which means closeness. So kirvah, closeness. Korban is this. It's a metaphor. I'm going to get to just one second. It's a metaphor. It's a vehicle for communicating something more. Jeff, you had a question.
But clearly, there's two in a relationship. So don't you both have to have this common understanding of what you're on about? Because it's no good you having all these intentions about, but it's got to be reciprocal. So what's the
right? So what's the ring back? Yeah. So I gave the gift to my wife, but does my wife give something back? So I gave the gift, so to speak, to God, but
not so much the gift, but it's what lies behind the intent.
What lies behind it? Yeah. How do we know that we're being that it's being received and then the love is being reciprocated back? Yeah. So there's the reciprocity there too. I remember. I was gonna say this later, but I think, Jeff, this is a good point. I had a rabbi in the States who I used to learn with for a while, and over Zoom back in the days when that was like, not over Zoom, over Skype, back in the days when that was not something which was normal, right? Nowadays anyone can communicate with anyone anywhere and it's all fine. But so back in the day, I used to have a relationship, a great session with him once a week, and he said to me, sort of provocatively one time, he said, if there was one sin that God said to you, you have a 24-hour grace period with. Like one sin that God's like, just go for it. You have your 24 hours. We're not going to keep stock. No one's watching. Like, I've turned off the heavenly CCTV. You're fine. So what would it be? So I'm like, racking my brain. What does he want from me right now? This is a trap. This is a weird trap. So he says, I tell you what mine is. He says, I would love to worship idols for a day. So that seemed pretty strange as a sin that he would really be interested in. He wants to take a graven image and hold it close to his bosom and worship the graven image. What's going on? So he said, it's sort of akin to what you're saying, Jeff. He said, my whole life I daven and I pray 3 times a day. I'm saying these words. And you think about it, how much time every day is given over to davening? Maybe an hour and a half, maybe more, depending on how long. That's a lot of time for busy people, and even for not busy people. That's an hour and a half of time every day. So what's that per week? Let's say Shabbos is 2 hours. So this is where my maths goes bad, but that's like 11 hours a week. That is, let's call it 10 hours a week. Let's call it then 500 hours a year, let's say, on average, and more. Then you've got Rosh Hashanah, you've got Yom Kippur. It's more than 500 hours a year. 500 hours a year. If you daven 3 times a day, 500 hours of time. I spend all this time, year upon year upon year. A decade of life, that's 5,000 hours. It's a lot of time. But I stand there, he says. I stand there and I just don't know sometimes. I don't feel the immediate sense that I'm reaching out and something else is receiving me in its place. And if I could hold something, to daven with, to touch, or to be feel held by, he said that would be his sin for 24 hours, to feel that relationship tangibly there. And I have to let you into a little secret. I have my own little idol worship, lahavdil, a little bit. My own little idol worship is that when I daven and my kids wander into shul, so if my kids are there and I'm like in the process of my Shemona Esrei, my process of my davening, or I'm about to start, I will often pick up one of my kids and hold them, or I'll just touch their face, or I'll just look in their eyes. Because I can see a soul in my kids sometimes, like not when they're being disgusting necessarily, but that's a good challenge. But when they're there and you look at them and you feel them, there is a tangible connection to their divinity, and it sort of augments a connection to my own relationship to Hashem. Again, that word, what on earth does that mean? But you can feel it. You can feel something tangible. There's a concrete expression. Even if it's just when I bow down and say thank you to God, I say modim, and I'm holding a child, and I'm holding like the greatest gift that God has ever given me, and I'm thinking I have this outpouring of thanks, an outpouring of just I can't even use words. Like my heart rips from my chest to say thank you to Hashem for this gift, this kindness. So but there, I suppose, Jeff, I'm feeling the gift back because I'm holding the gift back. I'm holding that manifestation of what that relationship could have meant or does mean. Okay, so that was just the introduction. We often have like quite long introductions, but the introduction here was the idea of symbolism or metaphor, that we have to go into the process of sacrifices by recognizing that it's impossible to have maybe this direct concrete relationship with God. I can't dance with God in the kitchen necessarily. So I need to use something that is going to represent more than just the thing itself. So meaning the death of an animal it's not about the death of the animal, right? It's not about the ring in terms of the actual physicality, the precious metals and the stone. It's about what does this represent? And so we're going to have to go into the sacrifice by thinking about what it represents and what it communicates. And we're going to talk a bit about this on 3 levels and building from the most broad to the most specific. The first level is, what's the deal with the blood? What's all the blood about? And I know this made Suzanne squeamish last time, so I apologize. You remind me, by the way, Suzanne, you reminded me last time after the session, you triggered me that when I was thinking about becoming a medical doctor, like my mum, hi mum, she's on. So there was this medical conference for keen A-level students that we all wanted to do if we wanted to go into one of these like very fancy medical schools. You put it on your UCAS form. I attended that conference, and it was famous that every year they had the blood lecture, which is when they basically wanted to freak you out with all the worst imagery and just see how many people they could get to faint. So I'm really not trying to get you to faint this evening, but we do have to talk about why there is such a focus on blood when it comes to sacrifices. Because often when we think stereotypically about sacrifices, we think about giving up life, and then we think about cooking meat or burning meat, but actually the heart of the sacrificial service is all about blood. So we have to work out, why on earth is blood? What does blood have to do with this? And the Torah's got some really interesting words to use to think about, to describe the significance of blood. So that's level 1. Level 2 is to wonder about why we're using animals. So yeah, I know you have to use blood, but okay, but what are these animals? What's the purpose of sacrificing animals? Why not bloodlet, for example? And that's what they used to do. They used to sacrifice humans. But you don't have to kill yourself to bloodlet. You could just, I'm just saying. So the question is, what are the animals doing? And the third level is, now that we're using blood and we're using animals, well, there are different types of sacrifices, and what do those different types of sacrifices also communicate in terms of a relationship? And I suppose, you know, a relationship is not just one faceted or one tonal. It's multi-tonal. It's a harmony of different experiences and different emotions. You don't feel the same thing for the same person all the time. You feel lots of different things, and they could all be quite positive, but they can all be quite varied. So the third question is about what are the different types of sacrifices about? Okay. Any thoughts, questions, or comments before we jump in? So let me begin with a trigger question for you about the idea of blood as the sacrifice, blood as the essential part, that this is the heart of it. And as I mentioned before, you slaughter the animal, and then the first thing you have to do is receive the blood in a big basin. And you rush the basin over to the altar and you sprinkle it in a particular way onto the altar itself. What do you feel when you hear about this idea of blood being an act of service, being an act of worship? How do you resonate with that? I'm really asking for a reflective question this evening. It's less about what the text has to say and more about how the text is communicating an idea, because this is very much an emotional space, I think, when it comes to service of God, a relationship with God. What do you think, Rena?
I mean, my immediate reaction is how primitive. That's my immediate reaction.
Okay, so you're like, this is a very aversive reaction to you.
Yeah.
It's interesting, Rena, because, you know, blood as a form of communicating relationship isn't just old. You know, if you think about blood brothers, right, before all the AIDS scare, that used to be the high point of a relationship, is that you'd cut your thumb, the other person would cut their thumb, and you'd sort of make this very visceral demonstration, or by putting your blood together, that we were blood brothers, or we were connected somehow. How do you relate to that?
I mean, I sort of, that's one level. The other level is that blood is a life force. If the blood stops flowing, you die. I mean, you know, blood represents life. So that's a different level already. I mean, as you said, you wanted the immediate reaction of pouring blood, you know, sacrificing an animal, cutting its throat, taking its blood and pouring it on the altar.
Yeah.
That is a bit horrific.
Right.
But on the other, there's another level that the blood represents life.
Yeah. So then if we were to say that blood represents life, and I'm using blood to serve God, so where does that take you in terms of your thinking?
Well, you're sort of, I suppose, on a different level. You know, you give your life for God, or you'd give life to God.
Okay, fantastic. That's lovely. Thank you. Anyone else?
You could flip it. Sorry, I know you can't see me, Samuel. You could flip it, Rabbi. You could flip it and say, Hashem gives life to you. Therefore, you're returning something, giving something back in return. If you're trying to create a relationship, a two-way relationship, as Jeff mentioned, that's one way of perhaps perceiving that in a more physical way. Right.
Okay. So there's a reciprocity there, possibly, that blood represents life, but it also represents me somehow. It represents not just me giving my life to God, but also God being the bestower of life upon me. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so then there's a reciprocity there. Okay, and that's coming from the doctor, right? So that's about your perspective, maybe, on protecting other people's life and how that's a gift. Okay, yeah, Werner.
You said, how does it make you feel? Discomfort. Just and the mess.
So I think that's interesting, because I wonder, sometimes you might wonder why blood does make us feel squeamish. So why blood is sort of so arresting. It's almost like this horror we have with blood, but a fascination with it as well. So one of the suggestions that I was reading about was that blood demonstrates our inherent vulnerability. You know, that this, as Rena said, this is our life force, but it's so easy to bleed. I had an accident on Cholamoyed on my bike, so I scraped up my back and was pretty nasty. And it's so easy to bleed. It is, and you can, and one can feel very vulnerable because this life force, which is fundamental to us, could so easily be taken away. We can so easily bleed out. So maybe that discomfort is also because we're all sort of on the edge of life and death, or on the edge of our finitude on some level. I'm going to add a new sort of like piece to the mix, which is to share some text with you. And this is in Exodus chapter 24, and it's talking about when the Jews are receiving the Torah. And it says, Vayichtov Moshe as kol divrei Hashem, vayashkim ba'boker. So Moshe wrote down all the commandments of God, and he got up in the morning, vayivem mizbeach tachas hahar, and he set up an altar underneath the mountain. So this is talking about the receiving of the Torah, and he set up 12 different pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. This is the point, that there's going to be the receipt of the entire Torah. And you should know that just the verse before it is Moshe went up to the mountain, Moshe came down from the mountain by Sapel Am Kol Divrei Hashem. He said to the nation all the words of God, Ve'ez Kol HaMishpatim, all the laws, Vaya'an Kol Ha'am, and the whole nation responded, they spoke up, Kol Echad, with one voice, Vayomru, and they said, Kol Hadvar Masher Dibar Hashem Na'aseh, all the things that God told us, Na'aseh, we will do. This is the famous receipt of the Torah. This is the Na'aseh, the Nishma, this is what we will do. We will learn, we'll understand. This is the receipt of the Torah, and this is the covenant. This is the point where God and Israel meet. And you want to talk about reciprocity. This is the reciprocity. Moses is the intercessory between the children of Israel down at the bottom of the mountain, God, so to speak, at the top. Of course, God's everywhere, but Moses is communicating across that chasm, across that divide as the prophet of God. He's communicating between the children of Israel and God and saying, do you want this relationship? God's offering it to you. They say, we want it. There's a building of relationship. And what happens is something which is very, very strange. So they send out the young people of the children of Israel, and they offer up burnt sacrifices. Here the sacrifices again, and they offer up slaughter offerings, shlomim, peace offerings, la Hashem, to God, porim, their bull offerings. Here we go. At this moment in time, at this moment that the entire nation has decided they're going to have a relationship with God, Moses takes half of the blood, vayasim ba'aganos, he puts them in basins, v'chatzi adam zarak on his beach, and half of the blood he throws on the altar. So already the blood is being used, and then what happens? Vayikach sefer habris, he takes the book of the covenant, vayikra ba'oznei ha'am, and he reads it to the people, vayomru, and they say, Kol asher dibar Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. Now it's finally, we've got that full expression of receiving the Torah. We'll do it, we're going to understand it, we're going to learn it. And then what happens? They've finally received the Torah. Vayikach Moshe Sadam. Moses takes the blood, vayizrek ala'am, and he throws it on the entire nation. This is the high point of the religious experience. This is the moment where finally we've got the Torah. We've received the Torah. It's like you can't get any closer to God than this. God is reaching out to you and desiring a relationship. And this is not some pure white chuppah. This is a bloodbath. There's blood everywhere. He's thrown it on the whole nation. This is the blood of the covenant that God has cut with you, that God has wrought with you on all these things. Okay. So we see that blood, it's so unexpected. I think I must have read that, I don't know how many times. I probably laned it. I never noticed the fact that the essential part, the high point of the children of Israel receiving the Torah, we often think, Na'aseh v'nishma, we're going to do it, we're going to understand it. And then it's met with showers of blood everywhere.
You think they'd have turned up if they knew they were going to get blood thrown at them?
I mean, it must have been a harrowing experience. It must have been absolutely sort of just arresting. We talked about going to a conference for 15-year-old aspiring medical students. Imagine being in this nation and there's all these people running around throwing blood on you as you've just decided to have a relationship forever with God. All of a sudden, you're having a blood shower. It's very. What does that feel like? And I think that everything that you said this evening contributes to understanding what that could feel like. It could feel vulnerable. It could feel like I give my blood to God, that I somehow have metaphorically demonstrated that my life force is entirely devoted to him, but also the other way around, that I am reliant upon God for that blood force, that I recognize that in this relationship is the heart of my existence. By bringing him into my life as master and as God and as Lord and as King and as Father, I'm noting that yes, all of me, even my blood comes from you. My beating blood comes from you. And what does the Torah describe blood as? What is the verse that we see over and over again, which is why we're forbidden to eat blood and why Jews drain the blood out of the animal prior to eating it, in terms of the laws of kosher? Anyone? Just unmute. Ki adam hu hanefesh. Blood is the soul. Blood is the life force. As you said, Rena, blood's the life force. We are now engaging with a metaphor of life force. That's why we can't eat the blood of an animal. That's why God says, don't eat blood. Dam hu hanefesh. Blood is the soul. Blood is the soul. Blood is the life force. You know, when you think about souls, sometimes you think about halos. On Zoom, it's great. Did we do this last time? Showed you my halo on Zoom. Yiska loves this. It's absolutely amazing. You can just, there you go. That's my soul, right? That's my soul. That's not my soul. That's far too outside the body. My soul is the pulsating life force within my body, beating around through a nice big muscle called the heart, allowing everything to function, sending all the nutrients around the body, taking all the different parts, the microchips, of course, from the Pfizer vaccine. Joke. Anyway, it's all there. Stephen.
I was just thinking along the lines of something like it's so different to vampires, isn't it? Where they actually take the blood they crave the blood for their own life, whereas we're not craving the blood to make our life longer. We're using the blood for something else.
But I think that idea of vampire is such a powerful. It's a great. Where do all these things come from? You have to know that in the Talmud there's all these different stories. By the way, you want to know where zombies come from, vampires, unicorns, demons. It's all in the Talmud. But and those stories. But vampire, that's a very powerful myth that someone else can take your life force, can yearn life from your life. Can nourish themselves from your life. It's a very visceral image, and actually, it's. I think it's a helpful sort of hook for some of these ideas, but just in a sort of slightly deviant form in terms of what we're trying to communicate. What we're trying to communicate here is that why is blood the heart of sacrifice? Because that is the fragility of human life. That's the vulnerability of human life. It's my life force. It's my nefesh. It's my soul. And I'm trying to use that entity, which looks the same when it's animal as when it's human. Animal blood doesn't look any different from human blood. I'm taking something which looks like it's my life force, or at least it's the life force of a living being. And I'm using all that relationship, but both the fact that my life force is being donated, so to speak, up to God, and that God is the point upon which my life force is dependent to sit at the heart of a relationship. And that's what we see at the Sinai moment. The Sinai moment, which is, yes, it's a declaration of love. It's a declaration of commitment. But how do you actually represent that in a ring? By heaps and showers of blood, filling that moment with life force, saying that this covenant is my life force. It is built in that. That's stage one. Any thoughts, questions, comments? And by the way, yes, it is harrowing, and yes, it is aversive. It is, but it's also very real. Okay. Next question. Why animals? Why not something else? Well, if we're going to realize that blood is the metaphor that is so powerful, so visceral, so grounded, it's the vehicle for communicating all of those different parts, but maybe summed up in dam, blood, nefesh, soul. It's communicating soul. So whose blood am I going to use? God's not so keen on us using our own blood, for possibly obvious reasons, that this blood metaphor got taken to the nth degree in older, more primitive societies in the form of human sacrifice. And we know that human life is sacrosanct, is holy. So it's not going to be any good to start offering up human beings to God. So we need some vehicle to demonstrate that. Why are animals the vehicle to demonstrate that? You should know, by the way, that it's not only animals that are used as sacrifices. We also have sacrifices which come from meal offerings. They're called mincha offerings. So what's going on? So we're going to look at this in two levels. The question of animals we've broken down into two parts. The first part is the idea of tribute, and the second part is the idea of substitute. Let's look at tribute to begin with. If we look at the sequence of creation, we go from the least complex life forms to the most complex life forms, ending at the pinnacle of creation with the most complex life form at all, which is of course woman after man. And that's definitely true. but we go from the least complex to the most complex. The level of complexity down from humans is animals. But those are the next most complex life form following on from humans. And we as humans are placed in charge of the garden. We're placed in charge of all the different forms of life that are out there. And so you could wonder, you could say, as a human standing in this stage of Earth, maybe I'm in charge. Maybe I'm the boss. I've got dominion over all these different things. You know, you can, and the more that technology has given us new means, and the more that science has given us new technology, so we've got more and more means to subdue and manage this world, to really demonstrate that we're in charge. We're the balabayas, so to speak. We're the guys at the top of the show. And so there is something quite powerful about taking the next most complex life form down and giving it to the most complex form of life. It's even difficult to talk about God as a form of life, but to then say that we are not the top of the pedestal. We're giving a tribute to what is truly at the top of the pedestal. What's that? That's God. And therefore, there's something else by which we demonstrate our dominion over the world, and that's through also our agricultural bending of the world to our needs. So that's why a meal offering might also be a form of an offering to metaphorically demonstrate that we are giving those things that we have control over, and we're offering it as tribute to the true creator. It's like saying, you know, you created the iPhone, but then you actually gave the iPhone away. Lahavdil. But the point is that in an agrarian society, the thing that you have ownership over, you're making as a tribute to God. And so therefore animals feel like they are positioning God at the top of the food chain, so to speak. They're put at the top of the complexity chain, recognizing that he is above us. And then why what is this process of taking the life of an animal? So that's going back to the blood again, which is this idea of substitute. And we spoke about this last time, and this comes on to what Nachmanides says about sacrifices. And this is Nachmanides in his famous commentary on sacrifices. He says, when a person takes the animal, they don't just slaughter the animals and then off they go with the blood service. There's a piece of the process that we haven't spoken out yet fully. They take their hands and they rest their hands on the animal. It's actually called smicha. You know, like a rabbi gets smicha. Back in the day, that was because Moses rested his hands on Joshua, and Joshua rested his hands on his student, and then his student rested his hands on the student afterwards. And that's a passing over. That is a imbuing with responsibility, imbuing with everything that you represent, that Moses represents, that Joshua represents in that generation, imbuing that responsibility into the next generation. And there's a similar process with the sacrifice, that you lay your hands, let's say, on the head of this lamb. Mary had a little lamb, and then she killed it in the temple. But Mary rests her hands on lamb's head and invests it with Mary-ness, so to speak. She puts something of her own sense of self metaphorically into the lamb, such that when the lamb's blood is spilt, it's not just lamb's blood that is spilt, but it's also representing Mary's blood. That the vulnerability that we spoke about is not just using blood as a metaphor. It's trying to use the blood as a metaphor for my blood. It's trying to bring myself, my very being, into this moment. That I am substituting lamb for me. I'd give you anything, I say to God. I'd do anything for you. I would give up my whole life for you. I would want to meld my life with you. This is where the concrete expression of a metaphor really comes to the forefront of our mind. You know, I can't hold God's hand. I can't hold God in my arms or feel held. But what I can do is use this very visceral moment to say, but I would do anything for you. You know, with a human being, you can hold them, you can touch them, you can be intimate with them, you can sacrifice yourself for them if necessary. But God isn't asking us to jump off a cliff, but God is asking us to engage in a moment of intense emotion. We spoke about intense emotion last time, whereby I say, I would. My life is yours. It's dependent upon you. And this is how I can show it. And so we move then from tribute of an animal, a tribute to the creator of all, to a substitute of myself. If you want to think about that, it's sort of dancing between immanence and transcendence there. It's finding God in this moment, it's transcending myself. We'll talk about that in just a moment as well. So that's the second stage, is the question of animals. Why animals? Tribute on the one hand and substitute on the other. By the way, why is it that so many times in the prophets we find God seeming to reject the sacrifices of Am Yisrael, of the children of Israel? In Samuel, in Isaiah, in so many other places, God says, I don't want your sacrifices. I don't want them. According to what we've just said, why wouldn't he want them? They're beautiful. And the answer there is that when this represents, when this activity, this ritual represents what's going on inside the heart of the person standing there in the temple precinct in Jerusalem, it's beautiful. But when this is just one other thing that you have to do, one other ritual that is a rule book attached to it with people tapping you on the shoulder and telling you you're not doing it the right way, when that is all that it is, it's reduced to simply following a set of rules, but there's no inner heart to the experience, then it doesn't communicate anything. Then it's just killing animals. It's just throwing blood around. Who wants to do that? Who thinks that's nice? That's the same thing that we feel nowadays in shul, by the way. When shul is just saying words and you don't feel a thing. It's just a set of rituals and rules that have no substance, that have no meaning, that aren't transforming this moment into a moment of closeness, of a relationship. It's just a bunch of words. It's just a bunch of blood flying around. But when it's real, when it's your heart, when you feel something, then it's beautiful. Okay, final part. What about the different types of sacrifices? Something that will strike you when you read the first two parashiot, the first two Torah portions of Vayikra, of Leviticus. It's just how many different types and all the different rules. And if we really had time, we could drill down into all the different rules, all of the different aspects of the sacrifices. But I want to focus on 3 different types of sacrifice and 3 different sort of nuances in their rules. The first type of sacrifice is a chatas, a sin offering. This offering is notable in the fact that part of it is burnt to God and part of it is eaten by the priests. It is not eaten by the owner. The second type of sacrifice is a shlomim, is a peace offering. This is eaten both by the altar. There's a part burnt on the altar a part eaten by the priests, and a part eaten by the owners too. So it's a three-way split of the meat. And the final type of sacrifice is an elevation offering, an olah offering, which is entirely burnt on the altar. What's the difference between the representative forms, the metaphor of altar eats it with priests, that's a sin offering, altar, priests, and owners eat it, or only the altar eats it? What's going on? Why does that make any difference? And what are these different sacrifices about? So we've spoken about blood, we've spoken about animals, but let's talk about sacrifices. Essentially, you want to have different moods when it comes to coming close to God. So one more question for you before we dive into this part. What moods might you be interested in having when you come close to God, when you visit his house? How might you want to feel or look to feel?
Comforted.
So comforted meaning like held?
It's supported.
Supported. Okay, so you want to feel that sort of the loving closeness of God.
You feel at home.
Okay.
Because God is embracing you and you're embracing God.
Great. Okay. That's a beautiful metaphor. That's a beautiful image, Michael. Being
Thank
held and holding in turn.
That's the way I feel.
Good. Anything else? Anything maybe a bit less positive? Or differently positive? Rena?
Well, you could be frightened. You could be in awe. Obviously.
Good. Okay, so I think awe and fright might be two different things. So I think fright might come from a sense of good old-fashioned Jewish guilt. And who doesn't feel that? And awe might be a sense of there's no me. There's just infinity. Which is terrifying, but it's not terrifying out of guilt. It's just terrifying in the sense of God's majesty, God's infinity.
What about you're actually going with a shopping list? You've got stuff you need to discuss with him because I want this, and we need to fix this, and you need to fix our kahila. And because that's all tefillah is. Tefillah is thanking God for being God, making him kadosh, and then asking him, by the way, if you happen to be, how about?
So you might feel needy. You might feel like you might feel needy. Yeah. Okay. I'm afraid I can't help you with your kahila, Dad. You have to. But yes, so you might feel needy. Good. So we've got being held, we've got love, we've got being held and holding in return, feeling comforted. I think I would bracket those all in a sort of a similar sense of feel. We've got also maybe guilt, maybe a sense of shrinking away, fear in the actual sense of having done something wrong and needing to make amends. And then we've also finally got the sense of awe of God's majesty, God's might, God's beyondness. Okay, so those are the three different types of offering. Let's go through them one by one.
Sorry to interrupt. What about gratitude?
Gratitude. So I think gratitude is also, I would label that in part of the love, in part of the comfort, in part of the full sort of wholesomeness of the relationship. Jeff?
You'd be inadequate. You feel, God, you're so massive and I'm so small and,
Inadequate. Yeah. And fine. So we'll try and deal with those. And also I think I can refine the answer to my mother's point about thanks. You'll see that there's a Thanksgiving offering, which is an appendage to the love offering. So it is a similar theme, but it's given its own space. So we start with the chatas offering. Maybe it's sort of like the good Jewish guilt that we feel certainly at least once a year, coming into the high holy days, we feel this sense of we're not worthy, we're not good enough. For some people, that's all their religious experience ever is, because they only ever rock up to shul 3 times a year, and that seems to be the dominant theme of those days. For other people, it's a healthy point to contemplate where they are and where they want to go. And we come to the concept of chet, which is often translated as sin. I always like the way that it's described from the writings, from the written law, that it talks about when an arrow strays from its target, it's described as machti, as a sin, so to speak, a chet. We'll use the word chet. When an arrow strays from its target, that means that as a shining soul, we had a target. The target was to become as refined and as dignified as possible a human being could be. That our soul was meant to shine forth and be the driving force of our being, and be in control of the animalistic urges that we have, and instead to be designated and devoted to higher causes. And when we deviate from that target, it's called machti, it's called chet. And we feel embarrassed of that. We feel like we have strayed from the territory that we were meant to be patrolling. And instead, we've wandered into someone else's territory, so to speak. You know, God said, this is the territory you have to be in, and we've gone into forbidden ground. So we can't eat from that sacrifice. We have to, so to speak, give of our territory to something else. So the altar eats of that sacrifice, and the priests, as the representatives of God, eat of that sacrifice. It's a reasserting of boundaries. It's a reasserting of trust and respect. I can't eat because I had the forbidden fruit. I need to give of myself. I need to realign by saying that those boundaries need to be asserted, that those who represent God, they should eat. I give back. It's my payback. It's my making amends. That's the chatas offering. Let me get all the boundaries of our relationship in place once again. Anyone who's ever had a good relationship with someone and they've betrayed your trust on whatever level that meant for that relationship will know that without those boundaries being put back in place, there's no relationship anymore. It's the bedrock of a relationship. It's trust, respect. Hachatas offering. They eat. Let us put those boundaries back in place. I can't eat. The next stage of a relationship is the comfort. It's the love. It's the holding. It's the finding, it's the then allowing that trust and respect to feel healthily holding of us all. It's feeling God right here with me. And that's the shlamim, that's the immanence of God, that's the peace offering. The word shalom coming from the word shalem, which means to be whole, to be complete. It's when you feel whole and complete with God, that the relationship is good and intact, represented by the altar eats, the priests as the representatives of God eat, and I eat. We all eat. We eat together. It's the sharing of the sacrifice. And then finally, there's this moment when you realize that the relationship with God, so to speak, relationship is unlike any other relationship. It's not akin to anything else because God is infinite. And as much as I can feel his closeness right now, when I also consider what God is as an immanent being, so as a transcendent being, as infinity, and therefore I am nothing. So I have nothing to say. No one has anything to say. No one can eat. I can't eat. Even the priests can't eat. It's just the altar. It's all for you, God. Everything is for you. And that's the Ola offering. That's the elevation offering. It's entirely burnt up to God. Can you feel these things without the tool of a sacrifice, without the metaphor of blood, of animals, of tribute, of substitute, of particular form, of the way that you bring it? Yes, you can feel those things. But without the reminder, without the constant ability to revisit that relationship, we can grow apart. I often quip, because my rabbi used to quip to me. He said, getting married is a big deal. You're getting a permanent roommate. So there's no way to avoid that relationship unless you don't go home, You have to work on it. You have to revisit it every day. You have to try and set aside times to make it work. But without putting in the effort to revisit the dimensions of my relationship with God, to revisit what it means to have a relationship with God, so we can grow apart, not necessarily by will, but simply by a lack of intention. And so the temple service, the sacrifices, give us concrete expression, give us the fact that we have to, at certain points of the year, at certain points of life, revisit that relationship and revisit it in a very tangible and practical way, with certain activities for that date, so to speak, that we are setting up with God. With blood and all that represents, with animals, with the tribute and the substitute, and then with the different types of engagement to feel out all those different parts of my relationship. The postscript to this would be that in the absence of the temple, it's even more difficult to do this. Now, you could argue that with the temple and all those different aversive parts, maybe that's difficult too. But I'm just bringing us back to those words of my American rabbi saying, I wish I had an idol to worship. I don't wish I had an idol to worship, but I wish I had a means, a tangible means to give concrete expression to my relationship with God. We don't yet have that, but we do have words. And that's where we would conclude traditionally such a discussion of sacrifices, is that now that there's no worship in the temple, the only place we find worship in terms of a formalized setting is worship of the heart and shul in our prayers. But maybe the postscript of that would be, is that ultimately we need to transcend that too, because many of us get stuck in those locations. And maybe then there really is a chance to dance with God in the kitchen, as I remember that God is really here in all moments. And if I can remind myself of that, I can remind myself that my beating blood, that the heart that is currently in my chest, that the blood that beats around my body is all for him. Maybe I can even have those moments at other times as well. Thank you everyone for chasing away the lullabies with me this evening from Vayikra. We continue next week to chase away the lullabies from the book of Leviticus by moving away from sacrifices, just as this book does, and considering in a more broad sense what it means to live with God in our lives, not just in the pinnacle of worship, but at other times as well. For the moment though, any thoughts, questions and comments? Greatly appreciated.
We
I
can
just- I
survive
found-
without all of our blood, can't we? So I mean, you know, you give blood, you give blood, you can give at least a pint without it affecting you. So you could give up your own blood, couldn't you? You wanted to.
You could. You have to be really good
You wouldn't have to
at
kill
making sure
somebody.
to know.
You wouldn't have to kill somebody as a sacrifice for that.
No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't. And Stephen, we do give up our blood at one point as men.
Circumcision.
There you go.
Yeah, but
And I said to you, through your blood you shall live. And I said to you, through your blood you shall live. That is the point of the Exodus, that the blood of the circumcision, the blood of the Paschal Lamb, create that moment where we're released from Egypt. So yes, we do too. And even if someone is circumcised and they convert, they still have to have a little bit of blood taken. It's the blood covenant too.
More fascinating stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Okay, until next week. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
I'm not sure that you'll get Suzanne back, but
Oh, he will, because he said there's no more blood next week.
No more blood next week.
way.
Thank you.
Thank you.